Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Trump asked Putin to spare thousands of surrounded Ukrainian troops as a Russian leader calls on the Ukrainian army to surrender in the Kursk region. Diplomats from the G7 nations have reached a deal on a joint statement aimed at showing unity after meeting in Canada. Cautious relief as Pope Francis marks 1 month in hospital where he's been treated for double pneumonia. Our top story today, President Donald Trump has said he has strongly requested that Putin spares the lives of Ukrainian troops. In a post on Truth Social, he said the US has had very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and there's a very good chance this horrible war can come to an end. He then goes on to refer to thousands of surrounded Ukrainian troops and says, I have strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. Meanwhile, in the last hour, Ukraine has rejected claims that its troops are completely surrounded by Russia. And President Zelensky has tweeted, Putin cannot exit this war because that would leave him with nothing, and has urged Trump to use the strength of America to force Russia into a ceasefire. We can now go live to Moscow to speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, whilst in the last few moments, Putin has called on the Ukrainian army to surrender in the Kursk region, what's the latest?
That's right. The Russian president is now holding a meeting with his Security Council, and starting that meeting, he said that he has read the appeal of US President Donald Trump to Russia to spare the lives of the Ukrainian groups of troops that are now isolated in Russia's Kursk region. And he said that Moscow is ready to guarantee life as well as decent treatment to those Ukrainian soldiers who actually surrender in those territories. He said that for that, the political and military leadership of Ukraine should give the appropriate order to its troops, and then their lives will be guaranteed. They will be treated in accordance with the international law and the laws of the Russian Federation. The Russian president has also said that the American side is doing everything to restore normal relations with Russia, and that is something that the Russian president is cherishing a lot, and this is the topic of the conversation that he is going to have now with his Security Council members.
Dasha, Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, has now left Moscow after meeting with President Putin last night. We're told Putin kept Witkoff waiting for 8 hours before calling him to the Kremlin. Do you think this was a tactical move on behalf of Putin?
Well, we know that on Thursday, the Russian president held a series of meetings, and those also were important ones because they were the meetings with Russia's closest ally, Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko's visit has been prepared long in advance, so it is known that the president's schedule is quite tight. However, we understand that the meeting between the president of Russia and the American envoy, Steve Witkoff, has indeed taken place. The Kremlin has confirmed that talk and said that in this conversation, the Russian president got more information, more details from the American side about the proposed ceasefire. We also understand from the Kremlin that in this conversation, the Russian president has conveyed his signals to Donald Trump regarding Russia's proposals and Russia's concerns about this ceasefire. The Russian president, we also understand, has had an opportunity to have a frank discussion, and the understanding in Moscow is indeed that Moscow needs to get more answers as to how this ceasefire will be implemented, because one of key concerns in Russia is that this ceasefire will be used for the respite for the Ukrainian troops. This is not what Moscow is willing to do. There are many issues of the technical nature regarding policing this ceasefire, control, verification, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that Moscow considers Trump's proposals as those that are really good in principle. Moscow just does say that there has to be more work done. And also the important thing here is that while Ukraine and the US are looking at this ceasefire as a one step towards the long solution for Ukraine, Moscow says there has to be one step. There has to be this lasting peace from the very beginning. And this is only when Russia will be agreeing to that ceasefire. So the work is in progress. The delegations and the representatives are meeting. They are talking. They have contacts at different levels. And now we are all expecting the conversation at the highest level between Trump and Putin to come in the next days.
Dasha, Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you for being across all of that for us this evening. Let's get into this further with former British MP and former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Good evening to you, Tobias. Thank you for joining me. So we've seen Donald Trump's latest post that has positive optimism that Russia is going to be making a deal, but both seem to be in a power play situation at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of describing it. I mean, despite the United States' efforts, there is no middle ground to be found between Russia and Ukraine. So what purpose does anybody signing up to a 30-day ceasefire actually provide? Russia has outlined its demands, including a ban on any future NATO membership. Putin has made it very clear he does not want to see NATO troops to be based in Ukraine. And why would Putin want to cease hostilities now when, as you've just been outlining, Russia is actually making progress on the battlefield? On the other hand, Ukraine wants long-term security guarantees, wants military support from the West, fearful that Putin is simply going to use the space to rearm, regroup, and do this all over again. And then you have the third dimension here, the United States. Donald Trump claims that he wants peace, but he rules out any U.S. involvement in any peace agreement. Donald Trump simply wants to step back from any involvement in Ukraine. He wants to stop spending money there. Indeed, he's dialing back from Europe. And what's got everybody scratching their heads here in Britain and on the continent as well is why is he increasingly backing Putin, calling Zelensky the dictator, supporting Russia? That seems to be a very bizarre change in attitude, in geopolitical direction from the United States. So it's a very confusing position here. But the idea that we're all going to sit down, agree a ceasefire, let alone a long-term peace plan, I think is a long way off indeed.
Zelensky says a ceasefire can be controlled with US help via satellites and intelligence help. So this is what he's asking the US for. What you've just said to me is the US wants to step back, Tobias. They don't want to be involved. What will this mean for a ceasefire and for Zelensky?
Well, this is huge. And you just touched on something that's so important. I could never imagine in the length of this war that's been taking place now for over 3 years, that the United States would potentially pull the plug on sharing of intelligence, which is exactly what they did. And that meant Ukraine couldn't actually register the incoming missiles and drones, and it led to the loss of life. And then to also halt the military support too. This all favors Putin. This also all supports the Russian advance. And we're now left in Europe recognizing that actually this is more than just about Ukraine, that Putin has an ideological challenge, a threat to the West itself, not least because you've also got sitting behind Putin is President Xi in China. So there's a big geopolitical change taking place at the very time, as I say, America is choosing to pursue a very, very different direction on its role on the international stage.
And I just want to bring something to you. You mentioned the Kursk region there a little bit earlier. Zelensky says the situation in the region is very difficult. We've just heard from Putin. He says he wants the Ukrainian soldiers to surrender in the region. Do you think that he's got the military upper hand and we're going to see him try to dominate this part, to get the territory back, as it's a bargaining chip in many senses?
Yes, that's right. It was a bargaining chip, is a bargaining chip, but ultimately it was an embarrassment for Putin. Never since the Second World War, I don't think, has any bit of the motherland of Russia proper been actually taken over by another state in this way. I'm surprised he's left it so late to try and take it back. But ultimately, if there are larger forces there that are making progress on the ground, you're simply going to see the Ukrainian forces retreat. I don't think we can believe anything about forces actually being surrounded in that sense. But it's the operational, it's what's happening on the ground. And the fact that you've got also President Putin strutting around, wearing fatigues, wearing, his military uniform, that's not the symbolic language of somebody that wants to sit down and do a deal.
Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, has left Moscow, Tobias, but with nothing. He doesn't have a signature or a deal, and we're still pretty much in the same situation. Yes, there's discussions going on, but what are the short-term dynamics of the ceasefire negotiation? Like, what comes next almost?
Well, what comes next is a fundamental decision for Europe as to whether it backs Ukraine now to continue supporting its efforts on the battlefield, or somehow we sign up and appease Russia and it's 1938 all over again. Because that, I'm afraid, is the fundamental reality check that we now face. That Trump pushing for a deal, any deal, just so perhaps he can get his peace prize. That leaves, I'm afraid, Putin ever stronger. He's the most powerful leader in Europe, more powerful than Stalin ever was, and he wants to emulate Stalin. He wants to take control, rekindle that sense of influence over Eastern Europe. And then we're left picking up the pieces there. And it has galvanized, there's no doubt about it. It's absolutely galvanized efforts here. Britain's increasing in defense spending. Germany is doing the same. Countries are actually coming together to say, fine, we cannot rely on America anymore. We've got to lean into this. Do we have the will, the political will? Because militarily, we've got the kit. Do we have the political will to support Ukraine in pushing Russia back?
Tobias Ellwood, former UK MP and former chair of the Defence Select Committee. Thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Hamas has said it's agreed to release an American-Israeli hostage, Edan Alexander. It will also release the bodies of 4 other dual nationals. The announcement comes after the Palestinian militants and Israel gathered for indirect Gaza ceasefire talks. A US influencer who snatched a baby wombat from its mother in Australia and uploaded the footage to social media has now left the country. In the video, Sam Jones is seen taking the animal from the side of the road whilst laughing and running away from the very distressed mother wombat. Her actions have been condemned online, with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese calling the incident an outrage. Tesla is warning that it may be exposed to retaliatory taxes in response to President Donald Trump's tariffs. The EV auto giant, which is chaired by Elon Musk, is now finding itself in a similar position to other US businesses wary by Trump's trade policies. It's not clear who at Tesla wrote the letter addressed to the US Trade Representative's office. And finally, Indians all over the world are celebrating Holi, the festival of colour. It symbolises the victory of good over evil and is marked by lighting a bonfire, spraying water and colour and sharing sweet dishes. Diplomats from G7 nations have reached a deal on a joint statement aimed at showing unity after meeting in Canada. The group of 7 ministers from Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States, along with the European Union, met after weeks of escalating tensions between the US and its allies. For more on this, I'm joined from Washington by our correspondent, Malone. Caroline, evening to you. This sign of unity couldn't have come at a more critical time right now, particularly with escalating tensions over tariffs.
Absolutely right. There's been an escalation with tariffs and duties and retaliation, and then other retaliation for the retaliatory tariffs happening in the last few weeks between the US and its G7 partners, so Canada and EU countries in particular. You know, in the last stage, we've had the US threatening to put 200% tariffs on goods such as wine and spirits coming from the EU, which could have a dramatic impact, particularly on goods such as French champagne. The US is its major market exporting from the EU. Now, having said all that, it looks like the G7 countries have managed to put those issues aside just for the moment, because they have come up with a statement at the end of these G7 meetings happening in Canada. And it has to do in particular with Ukraine supporting its sovereignty, its territorial sovereignty. Let's have more of a read to the statement itself. The communiqué saying that they reaffirmed their unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its territorial integrity, right to exist, freedom, sovereignty and independence. Now, this is critically important, of course, because it involves Russia's placement within the Ukraine and how it can potentially move forward with any kind of ceasefire deal. The G7 nations would like to get to a ceasefire, but they don't want to do so by compromising Ukraine's status and having to give up any of its territory, for instance. It's surprising in a way, though, that the US has managed to agree to this G7 statement because of some of the issues we've heard, in particular from your guest, the former UK MP, just a few moments ago, where, you know, Russia seems to be gaining a bit of an upper hand, particularly with increasing support from the US, from President Donald Trump. You know, Russia's statements that it's made about this potential 30-day ceasefire deal do seem to indicate that it agrees in principle to the idea of a ceasefire, but it has some major issues. And of course, it's given those demands to the US, to the envoy Witkoff just in the last few days. And one of the questions that Russia has raised has to do with who would oversee and enforce a ceasefire, who would be on the 2,000 kilometers of front line, for instance, between Ukraine and Russia, which seems to be a very good point. You know, who has the status to actually make sure that any kind of ceasefire moves forward? I still think there's still questions, though, as to whether Russia really wants this type of ceasefire. Now, President Donald Trump in the United States, though, is looking optimistic. He's spoken out on social media just this morning, saying on Truth Social that he thinks there's a very good chance this war can end. He is concerned, though, specifically about the Ukraine. He says, at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military in a bad way and vulnerable. You know, he is talking there in particular, we believe, about some of the Ukrainian positions within Russia that they've taken over the last year. So look, it's a complicated situation, but at the very least, the G7 has managed to agree that Ukraine's sovereignty is at least of utmost importance.
Yes, indeed. And whilst they were actually meeting, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, was sworn in today. He's got a tough job ahead, hasn't he, Caroline?
He certainly does. In some ways, you could say that he has been elected to the position because he's the right person to take on this job at this time. At least voters might think so. He is basically coming into what is already huge divisions with its formerly closest partner, closest neighbour at the very least, the United States. We know, of course, that there are tariffs already in place imposed by the White House on steel and aluminium. That impacts Canada and its EU partners. That could have a really strong impact, particularly on the economy of Canada, because the US is its biggest trading partner. Now, Canada has in recent weeks spoken about imposing duties on electricity. It supplies electricity to some of the 3 northern states on the border with Canada. So that's one point it has of leverage that it can push back. That was lifted within the day. Trump also threatening to impose future tariffs on other goods coming from Canada as well. And there's been, you know, greater division, really. You could see even within Canada from people sort of concerned about how this relationship is going forward. So it'll be very interesting to see how Carney moves forward with this, how he handles the relationship. So far, he seems to be trying to balance this idea of pushing back, trying to be strong to the United States, but clearly well aware that he needs the US in a lot of ways because of its economic partnership with Canada.
Caroline Malone in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Jewish protesters made their way inside Trump Tower in New York on Thursday afternoon, calling for the release of student activist Mahmoud Khalil. Khalil had been arrested by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement after leading the pro-Palestinian demonstrations at his university last year. Nearly 100 protesters were arrested today, according to the New York Police Department. Many led out in handcuffs into waiting police vehicles. Sarah Firth has this story.
A dismal moment in American history. Those were the words of one Columbia University professor in protest of the arrest and detention of one of their own, Palestinian student Mahmoud Khalil, who now faces possible deportation for his pro-Palestinian activism.
We will have our own ways in order to make sure that our voices are heard.
Freedom of speech is a protected and honoured constitutional right here in the US. A sketch of Khalil appearing in court on Wednesday show his pregnant American wife in a green headscarf in the stands behind him, watching anxiously on. Trump's administration has equated pro-Palestinian protesters with Hamas sympathizers. His lawyer has called what is happening to Mahmoud unprecedented.
The government, as far as we understand it, is relying on a rarely used provision in immigration law to justify the detention of a lawful permanent resident and his placement and removal proceeding. It is a provision that basically says that if the Secretary of State determines that a non-citizen's presence or activity in this country poses a serious risk of adverse foreign policy consequences potentially, that person can be processed for removal. Now, of course, that provision is not only rarely used, it is certainly not intended by Congress to be used to silence dissent.
But far from being silenced, the voices of those protesting for Gaza and now for Mahmoud are only getting louder. Thursday, more arrests as people protested both inside and outside the Trump Tower in New York.
Every American must resist and stand up, and we need to have actions like this and sit-ins like this and be willing. I mean, these people are out here putting their bodies on the line for our democracy. We all have to stand up and take that risk, because if we don't do that, our democracy will be gone. It's actually gone as we speak. Are we going to fight to get it back? We have to fight to get it back.
President Trump has already promised that Khalil's arrest is the first of many to come. And there are warnings that the outcome of this case could have ramifications for free speech and immigration across America.
Rescinding visas, canceling green card, and intimidating students and staff have become the tool of choice for stifling free speech and undermining the First Amendment. Columbia University includes Christians, Muslim, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, and athletes, and none of us will be safe unless we're all safe.
Mahmoud Khalil is many things, described by those who knew him as gentle. A prominent Palestinian activist, a green card holder, a husband to an American citizen, and a soon-to-be father. And he's now the first person at real risk of deportation as part of President Trump's campaign to deport international students who stood up and used their American constitutional right to free speech to say. Sarah Firth, Al Arabiya. Al-Arabiya. 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 Al-Arabiya.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. The UK economy shrank at the start of 2025, according to official figures which had been expected to show further anemic growth. The Office for National Statistics said that output declined by 0.1% during the month, following the 0.4% growth which was seen in December. A growth figure of 0.1% had been tipped by a majority of economists, but the ONS noted a slump in manufacturing output. Now, gold has passed the psychological level of $3,000 an ounce for the first time on Friday. Gold, which is viewed as a safe haven investment during times of inflation or economic volatility, has risen over 14% so far this year. This has been driven in part by concerns over the impact of US President Donald Trump's tariffs and the recent sell-off in the stock markets. Turning to sports news now, and Lewis Hamilton was the fifth fastest for his new Ferrari team as the Formula One season begins at the Australian Grand Prix. Hamilton was 0.42 seconds slower than his teammate Charles Leclerc, who set the pace in Friday's practice at Albert Park. The seven-time champion complained over the radio that he was struggling to turn the car. And Jack Draper has beaten big-serving American Ben Shelton 6-4, 7-5 in Indian Wells to set up a semi-final against two-time defending champion Carlos Alcaraz. Britain's Draper reached his first Grand Slam semi-final at the US Open in September, but has never made it to the last four at a Masters 1000 event. If Draper does beat Alcaraz on Saturday, he'll be guaranteed a place in the world's top 10 for the very first time. It's now been 1 month since Pope Francis went into hospital where he's been treated for double pneumonia. The 88-year-old hasn't been seen since February the 12th, and with his prognosis looking uncertain at times, there has been speculation about whether or not he might actually resign. This morning, the Vatican said he'd had another quiet night in hospital. Let's go live to Rome now to speak to our correspondent, Alina Trabattoni. Alina, thank you so much for joining me. So the Vatican has said the Pope's life does remain in danger. Do we know how long he's expected to stay in hospital at all?
We actually don't. I think it's safe to say that he will be there for the foreseeable future because, of course, one thing doctors are very worried about in terms of Pope Francis is that even though the major emergency of his medical situation has tended to calm down over the past week, he is a workaholic, and everyone's very worried that if he does go back to the Vatican, he will start working again in full force and will not recover properly. Now, doctors in the past month have been very, very careful about always stressing that his medical situation remains guarded, and so that means he is in danger. And what I need to stress is it's just been 1 week that we have had very reassuring medical bulletins, so that he slept well at night, that his blood count, his white cell count is good, there are no infections in his body. But just last Friday, he had two very severe respiratory crises, so severe that in both cases he had to have bronchoscopies, which is an invasive, medical instrument being put down your lung, a sort of rubber tube that, with a camera in it to help manage the situation and remove the liquid that had built up in his lungs over the course of the weeks due to his double pneumonia. So for the time being, no, I think it's safe to say that he will stay at the Gemelli Hospital in Rome, amid much media and much attention and prayers of many of the Catholics, the devout Catholics that are in Rome and in the Vatican in these weeks for the pre-Easter celebrations.
Alina, are there any indications that he could actually step down from his role? Because of what you just said, there's uncertainty about the time we're expecting him to stay in hospital and his exact condition.
Well, there's always a lot of rumors about this. Every time he has a health scare, he's not new to health scares. He had an operation surgery on his colon 2 years ago. He's been in and out of hospital having tests, but this is by far the most severe and serious medical emergency he's had. As now, there are a lot of rumors. We just don't know. I think we just have to wait and see. One thing, though, Pope Francis very early on in his pontificate made it be known that he had signed a resignation letter because, his message was if he ever got to the point where he was so incapacitated that he couldn't carry out his functions as pontiff, then, there was this letter and it would be enacted and, he would step down. Having said that, this begs the question, well, if he gets to the point where he is incapacitated, which obviously is not now and hopefully will not be for a long time, how can he actually then, put that letter in motion? There are rumors swirling around. We just have to wait and see how his health recovery pans out. For sure, he is 88 years old. He's had medical difficulties from a very young age. He had half a lung removed when he was 21, and he's also been in hospital for surgery other times in his life. And so he's not a stranger to, hospitalizations and hospital stays. But he is also 88 and he is frail, he's elderly. So, that all needs to be taken account of.
Alina, this is the longest the Catholic Church has ever actually gone without seeing the pontiff. As you said to me, it's a really important time in the Catholic calendar. It's Lent, which goes into Easter. What is the Vatican like without him? And who has sort of been standing in for him during this period of time?
Well, I think it's safe to say, and it's quite well known, that this prolonged absence has created an atmosphere of preoccupation, uncertainty, anxiety even in the Vatican, because he's always been a very, very present pope. Not all popes are as present, and he's very much made it his mission to be a pope of the people, constantly interacting with, faithful, with delegations. His days start very early in the morning and they carry on through the afternoon, evening. He's constantly either celebrating prayers or overseeing official functions. So he has created a sort of vacuum in the Vatican, with his being hospitalized. But his sort of top officials have been very good at, stepping in and running the operations. And, obviously routine operations are continuing, albeit at a slower pace, and some, have been cancelled and postponed. And this year is quite particular because it's a Jubilee year. So, actually Vatican and Italy itself and Rome itself is just awash with pilgrims from all four corners of the world. What needs to be said is that, one of the top officials, the Vatican's Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, has been celebrating a lot of the official functions and has taken on a crucial role in the sort of day-to-day governance of the Catholic Church. He's also led a lot of the prayers and masses that have been, held in St. Peter's Square and in the Basilica, towards being sent in the hopeful prayers urging a speedy recovery for Pope Francis. And also, some of his top cardinals have been very active as well, amongst which also Cardinal Michael Cerny. He's overseen several events and ensured the continuation of Vatican business. And it's also got to be said that Pope Francis from hospital has been very active as well. He's been keeping in touch with secretaries, people who keep him informed all the time. One thing that very much touches the heart is that, his connection with a Gaza parish, which he initiated on a daily basis ISIS at the start of the conflict in the Middle East, he did not suspend it when he went to hospital. And on some days when his health and his respiratory problems were so severe he couldn't actually call them, he sent them a text message. So, it's got to be said that everything is ticking on, but, his presence is very much missed.
Alina Trabattoni in Rome, thank you so much for your insights, and we wish the Pope well. A reminder of our top stories. Trump asked Putin to spare thousands of surrounded Ukrainian troops as the Russian leader calls on the Ukrainian army to surrender in the Kursk region. Diplomats from the G7 nations have reached a deal on a joint statement aimed at showing unity after meeting in Canada. Cautious relief as Pope Francis marks 1 month in hospital where he's been treated for double pneumonia. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess Watson with GNT. Good night and happy Friday.